I was invited by Art Canada Institute as part of the early phases of their series. So they're located in Toronto, and this was a series of online books that they began around that time in 2012. And so initially the book was part of that series and available online on the Art Canada Institute website, and also as a downloadable PDF. So you could still have a print version, but it was not a print book. So that just happened more recently, but it was actually produced as part of, again, Art Canada Institute reviewing the series of art books and then deciding to actually print some of them now as bound hardcover edition copies. So we were able to go back and have a bit of an editing process, an updating process too at this time, which was wonderful because lots has changed in 10 years. The scholarship continues to change around Carr and the context, understanding the context, particularly of settler colonial relations and our understanding of those things and how she fits into those relations. It's good to be reminded that when Emily Carr was born, women didn't have the vote and they didn't have it for many decades. You know, Victoria was when she was born, it was just right on the edge of it being a fort. So she still knew people who had been part of Fort Victoria, and she would ask those ladies what their experience had been. So it was very much a strange hybrid of a kind of Victorian England approach to women's lives, and then this kind of frontiers person approach to women's lives. But they were still very much economically dependent on support. So for Emily Carr, who grew up in a middle-class family, very much the father was very much, Richard Carr was, you know, an old-fashioned patriarch in many ways, and she alludes to having some conflict with his rigidity in her journals. And then she is orphaned basically by the age of 16. Both parents have died, and so what that means for her is that how she experiences, like one of the most crucial impacts on women's lives of patriarchy is the economic control. So for her, she then has her sister and the executor of the estate to try and negotiate with so that she can actually continue her artistic training. And the executor was more sympathetic than the sister was. So, you know, if you think about these challenges of having not only to produce your work, but to try and negotiate conditions that will allow you to receive your training, to have time to work, to travel the way that she did, both overseas. So she was privileged in that sense. She was from a middle-class family that initially did have those resources, so she could dream. You know, in a way, if you think about the way that she was framed as a kind of caricature and eccentric for many years, that's also part of patriarchy, to kind of try and grapple with who is this figure. If we're going to tell the story of this figure that's not fitting into any of our relatable kind of figures, then she's framed as a kind of outsider. And I think that's still happens for women to this day. You know, we still have that figure reserved for a woman who doesn't conform. I think what's really interesting is that she persists, to use that, she persists, you know. If you think about, you know, the courage for her to go on these solitary journeys. So for example, when she first goes to the UK, her sister accompanies her and then leaves as she starts her studies. So really for the bulk of the time that she's there, she does have family friends that live in Belgravia, which is probably one of the, you know, sort of very wealthy suburb of London. So she has family connections, but she's not staying with them constantly. She's moving as she goes from, in that case, from, you know, she's in St. Ives, she's in Bushy, she's struggling, she's hospitalized for hysteria for 15 months while she's in the UK, as she becomes kind of overwhelmed by her disappointment with the studies that were quite conservative, tries to kind of find new footing as she's feeling disappointed in herself and internalizing all of that. And I think that is also a signature of patriarchy, is when there's a structural problem, often women would internalize it as a personal issue. What was the structural issue for her, which was this kind of lack of support, the newness of her endeavor as an artist in her family. So those kinds of, lack of sort of structural understanding of what she was doing was very much part of what she was dealing with. And then as she goes through her life, her understanding of her own work is changing and changing. And so as she's doing those trips, so whether it's a trip to the UK for studies, even her trip to California, where she's stays with a single mother in California. And I think that informs her when she sees this woman struggle about what it means to choose that. This woman is on her own. Also, the backyard of her family home backed onto then Beacon Hill Park. So she would go out her back gate and she would just wander. And she described that feeling of wandering. She could hear, there were ponds full of frogs that she could hear from her window when she was falling asleep at night that are now transformed into cultivated ponds in Beacon Hill Park. So, it's a different relationship to landscape. So her embodied experience allowed her to feel at home, even as she's navigating patriarchy's idea of roles for women. So she has a little bit of a comfort being outdoors because of, just how life unfolded for young women at that time. And she's comfortable traveling on her own. And then, of course, in her middle age is going off to Haida Gwaii and interior BC and exploring all of these spaces on her own, bringing together all of the knowledge of all those journeys to France, to the UK, to California. Before she went to the UK, she went to Alaska with her sister. And at Sitka, she encounters a park where totems have been assembled for tourists. So they don't really make sense because they're all together in a kind of jumble. So you've got poles from different nations and different sites, all kind of assembled there in this totem walk. So when she first sees them, she also meets an artist from Alaska who describes to her his project. So he's working to record what he sees as a disappearing culture. So the salvage paradigm is a colonial idea which fits very neatly into the colonial project, which is that this is a disappearing race with disappearing culture. Instead of seeing this as an enduring communities suffering under colonial policies. So it becomes almost naturalized in the salvage paradigm, is just like a fading away of the old world. And she decides, I like this concept, I'm going to record these villages because they're disappearing. And it was that their way of life had changed from settler colonial contact, for sure. But the salvage paradigm takes it further and just acquiesces to this idea that there will be a total disappearance of this culture. So when she comes back with all of her modernist training from France, then she books passage throughout. So it's sort of the most extensive passage she does in BC and Haida Gwaii. She ends up in Haida Gwaii. So she has also, so she books steamers, but she also has local guides, local indigenous guides to take her out to the villages. And what she's decided to do is to record all of these and then offer them, these paintings, to the province, which she does, over 200 paintings at the end of this project. So a lot of in situ pieces that she did, watercolors and drawings, and then takes them back. Mostly the studio paintings are done at home in Victoria. And then she has a massive exhibition, one of the biggest solo exhibitions of her career. Now, when you look at the work from this era, you see the highly colored renderings of that post-impressionist painting applied to the British Columbia landscape. But it's specifically looking at the villages and looking at, so this is not where the forest paintings necessarily are happening. She's really looking at the populated villages and village sites, and some of them unpopulated too. So that's when you see the salvage paradigm is through this work where basically the project is to record these sites. And she returns to that over the next decades of her work. But that's the first time she takes it on as an actual project. And she's very vocal about it. She gives a lecture about this as well. Her lecture on totems is all about this project. So she feels like she's found her place really in this work. So it does two things. I mean, it's an interesting settler view too, to find an identity in relation to the other. That's very much a settler paradigm. Just so for me personally, as you encounter an artist's life in your 20s and you have this great imagination about, what that meant in terms of a risk, but as you work through and move through your own life, like I start to think of her, oh my gosh, in her 30s, on her own in the UK, in her 40s, facing this kind of precarity in terms of economics. And then as we move through into her 50s, where she's also then, she starts to have health issues in her 60s. So you see her grappling with all of these incredible challenges, and yet at the same time persisting. So she just keeps adapting and never giving up. So, and I have such a great appreciation now looking at, like, wow, these are still remote locations even in this moment.